Good morning, Bananamators. Welcome to Stylus Rumble. Today, we're going to be talking about lines. I've been thinking about how to approach the fundamentals without getting too repetitive, without telling people what they already know. And I think it's best to just start with the alphabet. So when we're drawing, we have three kind of ABCs. We have lines, shapes, and forms. So let's start with the first of those, lines. So up in the left-hand corner here, I have the types of things that we're going to be looking for when we're exploring reference that I've collected from the internet. I wish we had this kind of resource when I was growing up. It is an absolute fountain of information. So most of these I got from characterdesignreference.com. Living Lines Library is another really good one. So Living Lines and Character Design Reference, two excellent resources if you just want to explore animation art and kind of take these principles and apply them and see how they work. So what I'm going to do today is just kind of go through some different stuff that I've collected from these websites. And I'm going to talk about how we look for these things and how it applies to animation. Then next couple episodes, I'm going to do some different line art exercises and how I play with line and stuff like that. So let's start here. So the reason I started with Mulan, I learned to animate on paper back in dysentery days, and I had this cleanup teacher who did not pull punches when she reviewed our work. Like, she worked as a Disney cleanup artist, and she wasn't going to let us get away with any kind of nonsense. So she had us practice on Mulan, just cleaning up the lines. She said, Mulan is one of the most beautifully cleaned up animated features there is. The line art is super crisp, very, very tight. They have these beautiful long swooping lines, like just this is a pencil line. So the cleanup artist had really, really good skills. And she'd get down into this taper at like 500% zoom. And she'd be like, if this line isn't cutting me, it's not sharp enough. Your taper isn't pointy enough. So we would be expected to come in on to be super duper pointy, like. Okay, she'd be like, not the best, but acceptable. I loved her. That was the type of education I really loved, was when they weren't letting us get away with anything, because you learned so hard. So if you want to practice clean art, line art, like, I'm not sure if there are a lot of higher definition ones, but even if you take this and you bring it into a program, or you print it off if you have a light table. My dad made me a light table when I was a kid. He just like cut a hole in a regular table and put a duct tape plexiglass to it. And that was my light table. And that's how I learned. So you don't need fancy gear, but just take this and bring it into a scene. And then you want to practice not just the curve of it, but the actual thickness of the line. You want your lines to be the same thickness as their lines. This is really important in traditional cleanup, because if your lines change thickness, it will boil. So just contour lines. Mulan is an excellent resource for that. This is going to go real long if I keep going off. So here's another one that is super good for cleanup, because these like long swoopy antennas, those are really going to force you to work on your line art. And it's okay if you don't get it one big swoop. Sometimes you need to like feather your line and bulk it up and take your time, but forcing yourself to do it the hard way makes you stronger, right? So here's a good example of line that's not meant to be clean. It's an exploring line. We have a lot of blue pencil. Back in the older days, let me see if I have one. Let me check my stationery collection. We have a blue color erase, and they come in like all different colors, but they are actually erasable. So that's what we used to do these blue lines in. You can do them digitally now, that's fine too. But you can also just use Crayola blue or any other blue, because you can photocopy it out. You could scan it and then remove the color after also, and then use a actual pencil to like darken your lines in. So line art doesn't have to be right the first time. It doesn't have to be super crisp and clean. We don't start with those model sheet lines. That's not how it works. We start really rough and we find what we need, and then we clean it up later. And if you have to clean it up 5 times because your 4th time is still not good enough, that's what you gotta do to pass it in between class. So here we have a background. Here we're seeing line used as tone. So we're having hatching that is using just strokes to build up tone to create shapes in the environment. We have thicker lines here to bring this stuff forward. And then our lines back here, even though there's a lot more tone and shadow, it is lighter than the stuff here. Like this gray is lighter than this gray. Using lighter tones in the background, even though there's more shadow, is going to push your shapes back. Using these thicker lines here are going to bring that forward in space. So we're here, we can see a great example of all of these things. We have contour lines coming around here. We have line as texture. We're getting some little texture in here and like little bits of the house and stuff like that, building up some texture. Line is tone, all that hatching. Line weight here, the weight is, it's thicker, it's bolder. This is a heavy line weight. This is lighter back here. That's what, when you hear line weight, that's what that means. Gesture lines. So there's a beautiful gesture here. We have like swooping hills. We have like straights, like these bold things sticking straight up. When something goes whoosh, straight up, that's a gesture too. Doesn't need to be a swoopity swoop. It could be wah, straight. That's also gesture. We have organic versus geometric. This is an excellent example of that. We've got like these organic shapes in the hills, the rocks, and then we have geometric shapes in the building. They're not super rigid. Like we're not looking at something that's been drawn with a ruler and a super strict grid. It kind of feels settled and comfortable, which feels really cozy and rustic. Using your lines there to describe the type of town we're looking at. It's not a big urban sprawl. It's like a nice cozy place. And then up here, these have more straights and dedicated lines. And that makes it feel really solid. Like it's built, like, I mean, it's made of stone. So you feel like, oh, it's got some heft. And then direction. So, I mean, that's, you know, we've got the direction of the hills here. We've got these things pointing in toward our little village. And this stuff kind of pointing down towards our village. We've even got this triangle here made out of shadow that's bringing us back in. Lots of examples of all of the different things we're looking for in a line art drawing. This is more Mulan. So this one, we're finding all of the things that we were looking for there. So we have, you know, contour lines. Like here, they've really gotten quite thick around the edge of this thing because it was starting to get muddy and unclear. So they just used a bolder line to make sure that was very clear. Line is texture. This is a great example of that. Like we have the texture of the tiles on the roof. We have some texture in here. We're playing with a little bit more tone rather than line. Texture down in these sorts of places. And we're getting the gesture. And not just the gesture of the line, where we have sturdy straights here, and we've got wispy sort of grass here, but also we have some characters in here. So we've got a guy carrying some weight here, and you can see this is even a little bit bowed, so it's pulling down those heavy baskets. Even this little line here can have a story. Okay, so we're moving on to rescuers. I think I've copied these gestures 100 times. These are really expressive, dancey, sort of loose lines. It is on its way towards cleanup. Like these aren't the initial like roughs, but it's probably a clean rough. Like this isn't something that you'd see in the production, but it's just giving an example of how the character moves, the type of mannerisms she has. You can see she's got like very gestural, expressive, big hand gestures. That's, you know, that's the type of thing that character animators need to be aware of if they're trying to get the most out of individual characters and make them seem like different people. These are great if you're practicing gesture lines and trying to figure out how to get life out of things. And these are very clean. This isn't something you should aim for if you're just a beginner. Like you can't just crack this stuff out if you don't have the underlying principles really strongly in you. And the more often you have to draw the same character, the easier it is to redraw that character. You start to get a shorthand. Often now I feel like people are trying to race to the end and start with shorthand, and that's not how it works. Like you start with those really rough drawings where you build up the forms and you get comfortable with the proportions, and this is late stage. Like once you've been drawing them a lot, like storyboard artists have to draw the character hundreds of times, sometimes thousands of times. So by the end, you're starting to get this shorthand, but it's not done in the initial stages. This is something that works up to later. But when you start to be able to draw things this quickly, you get really fantastic gestural lines because you're not drawing the line, you're drawing what you're imagining you're drawing. So you're drawing the mouse. And it's hard to reach a place where you're drawing without thinking. Taking your time and really slowing down and putting those foundations in your brain deep, that's what's going to get you there, not rushing. Don't ever rush, right? So here we have one that's a lot more rough. And I just wanted to put this in because, like I said, not everything comes out in the first clean drawing. Line art, when you're exploring, can be very messy. This is super hairy. They were finding the shapes in here, and now somebody who had to come in next, whether it's the same artist or not, could pop this down. And we could say, okay, which of these lines, let's get a nice thick one, which of these lines is the right one? Let's find, say, this line. Let's maybe this one. This one we like. Boop. I'm going to draw in behind. Then we can clean up after. So we'd probably do like a clean rough before we went in and did a final. So we'd go in and find all the lines that are working, get this big hand in here, wrist, and then we'd think about, okay, we don't want the tangent, the coat to line up here. So we're going to just bring this back a little bit. That. And we were going to be able to find the big solid shapes and the clean lines out of what we have before. We don't need to do that the first time. When I found that out, I was so relieved. I just thought people drew good the first time, and it took such a weight off my shoulders when I started seeing real sketchbooks done by animators and not like show books that people put online with like perfect drawings. That's not a sketchbook. Okay, here we have the lines on this coat are describing the form. So it's taking line art and form and it's combining those things and finding the contours of going around. So this is another great exercise if you're working on the form part of things, is to take simple forms, like this is just kind of like a donut shape, half a donut, and then find the contours of that. Here we have a series of cylinders and we're finding the contours of that. So taking characters, simple characters, breaking them down like this into different forms, super useful for building up your form brain. Spirited Away, I adore Spirited Away. This is not finished line art for the show. Here we have more gestural lines where we're getting thick and thin, but if you look at the final product of the film, it's going to be more blunt finish. Here we have rough lines. This is a really clean rough, but I feel like this is just an experienced person who's put a lot of miles in doing these types of things is able to quicken stuff like this. This isn't something that you can expect to be able to rough out, but it's a great reference if you want to go in and just practice drawing environments, and you can see it, you can be a little loose about it, but like this person like has definitely a lot of experience working in like orthographic drawing. Another Spirited Away where we're using line as tone. And I included this one because we have these yellow lines. When you see something like this and there are different colors, that's explaining to the animation crew what needs to be done. So this yellow is a compositing thing. It's lit in here, it's not lit out here. You wouldn't clean those up when you're cleaning up the drawing of this like bouncy little light dude. So this is from The Great Mouse Detective, just another rough one because I wanted to like just reiterate, you don't need to get it super tight and clean the first time. Sometimes you're finding your lines, you're searching, and like, so you bold it up and build it up. These types of things, I've got used, like I have some, like this is a 4B. I have a lot of 2Bs. I don't know where they are. 2B is really good if you're working like this. I even have some like 7Bs or 8Bs, but I find those are a little bit too soft for me. But getting like building up this stuff with a really soft pencil, like a 2B pencil, is a good way to practice line control. Like working with 2B, you have to press very softly or you're going to crack it. So working with those soft pencils helps you be a little bit more delicate and kind of find the shapes gently, as opposed to like trying to carve out the perfect shape the first time. Another one where like really big, fat, bulky lines, just finding the gesture, not super concerned about cleaning this up. I wouldn't want to come in as cleanup artist after this person. And here we have the clean line art where you can see things are much tighter. The line thickness is more consistent, but this show, The Mouse Detective, has some texture. Like we have some fur here, some lines in the hair, texture in the stubble. So it's not a super simple show. It has some detail in here that's worth watching if you're just watching the film and seeing how they manage to track those things, because all that stuff has to be tracked. Like those little dots on the cheeks and stuff, got to track every single one of those dots unless you want it to pop off a boil. And the scarf as well, a little bit of detail here. But if you zoom in, you can see the consistent thickness of the line. We don't have a lot of thick and thin. It's coming to pretty blunt ends. We don't have a lot of like super, oh, there's a little taper here. If you're looking at cleanup of different shows, those are the type of things you look for, whether or not they're using line weight, how they're tapering their things, how they're using thinner lines on the inside and thicker on the outside. This seems pretty consistent. So the inner lines here on the scarf, similar in thickness to the outside here. Here we have a layout from Rick and Morty. The line art is pretty thick. And the line art doesn't actually get a ton thinner as we go back. It does get somewhat thinner, but they're using tone here as a way to help separate the different layers that have to be cleaned up separately. One of the things I like about Rick and Morty is we have these dashed lines. So there's holes in the lines as it goes around. There's a lot of, I've been watching One Piece, the animated series recently, and the backgrounds in that have a lot of broken lines and watercolor treatment, and I think it's really, really pretty. So you can look at backgrounds as well as character art. But when I'm looking at line art, anything in these websites or things I come across, these are the types of things that I'm looking for. I'm looking for how they're using contour to create depth. So how we can separate here from back here. And I think that while that is a more technically challenging drawing, I think this one shows more about how much depth you can get with just the tone of line and thickness. Even though this is a very simple drawing, it's really skillful drawing. It has everything we need to learn in working with line. It has the line as texture. There's a little bit of just dancing around to get some of those like foliage, a little bit here just to give some shape to the environment. Line as tone, so we're getting these darker shadows back here. We're even using the tone to direct our eye back into the image. We're looking at line weight, so out here we have thicker lines, back here we have gentler, softer lines just to create depth. Down here we have the most contrast, like blacks on whites, to really bring the eye to the focal point in here. Gesture lines, I mean, every line has a gesture. It can't help itself. So if you're drawing dead, your lines are dead. You have organic versus geometric. So I'd put the geometric stuff here where we're getting those verticals and horizontals. And down here, it's actually a little bit softer. And then direction. So we have like these things pointing in, these lines pointing that way to like keep bringing us back into very well put together image. So those are the types of things that I look for when I'm exploring animation art or any kind of art. And these are the types of things that I'm going to give you some ideas of how I like to practice them. But even just looking at these types of images with this little list that I have in the corner and asking yourself, where can I see these things in this image? It's going to give you a more richer understanding of the fundamental of just line. So that's it for this. If you have any questions or you have references that work well for this, please let me know down below. I have a big document of all the different references and stuff that I've been accumulating, and I'd like to keep making that grow. And I'd also like to make some kind of learning guide as well. So the more references you give me on things that are line art related, the more we can put together for our community of learning artists. Thanks for dropping by. Like, share, subscribe, all those things internet people ask you to do. And I'll see you in the next video. I guess episode 1 in my fundamentals extravaganza. Like, there's no plan. Beautiful. What are we doing? What is this? What is this plan? Good morning. Oh no. When I was 5, The Little Mermaid came out, and I was like, what sort of supernatural physics thing is this? How do they do this with just lines? And of course, the Disney 2D studios shut down just as I was getting into college. So it ain't it. It's not gonna happen. Anyway.